It was the summer of 1975 in Tillamook County, Oregon, a place where the Pacific Ocean met ancient evergreen forest, where fog rolled in from the coast like a living thing, swallowing trails and cliffs in silence. The air smelled of cedar, salt, and damp earth. The roads were narrow and winding, carved through wilderness that had stood untouched for centuries. In those days, Oregon was still wild in the truest sense. There were no cell phones, no GPS devices, no instant communication beyond crackling CB radios and landline telephones that sometimes went dead during storms. If you disappeared into the forest, you were alone. And on the morning of September 3rd, 1975, that's exactly what happened to Ranger William Bill Harrow. William Harrow was 41 years old that summer. He was a man of routine, precision, and quiet confidence, the kind of man people trusted without question. He'd been a ranger for nearly 15 years, most of them spent patrolling the coastal forests and cliffs of Cape Meares, a remote stretch of Oregon coastline known for its lighthouse, its towering Sitka spruces, and its isolation. Bill was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of long hours outdoors. He wore the standard Oregon State Parks uniform, olive green shirt, badge pinned over the left pocket, wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes from rain and sun alike. His hands were calloused from years of clearing trails, fixing fences, and pulling stranded hikers out of dangerous situations. He lived in a small cabin just outside the town of Netarts, a fishing community of fewer than 300 people. His wife, Eleanor, taught third grade at the local elementary school. They had 2 children, a daughter, Susan, 16, and a son, Tom, 13. By all accounts, Bill Harrow was a devoted father, a dependable husband, and a man who loved his work. He knew those woods better than anyone, Eleanor would say years later, her voice still carrying the weight of disbelief. He could navigate them blindfolded. He wasn't the kind of man who got lost. The morning of September 3rd began like any other. Bill woke at 5:30, just as the first grey light began to filter through the curtain. The house was quiet. Eleanor was still asleep. The kids wouldn't be up for another hour. He dressed in the dark, pulling on his uniform and lacing his boots with practiced efficiency. In the kitchen, he made coffee in the old percolator on the stove. The sound of it bubbling was the only noise in the house. He poured a cup, drank it black, and filled his thermos with the rest. Then he grabbed his clipboard, his keys, and his ranger's journal, a small leather-bound notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. Before leaving, he paused at the door and looked back at the hallway where his family slept. It was a habit of his, Eleanor said later. He always looked back, as if making sure everything was still there. Then he stepped outside into the cool, damp morning air. Bill's truck, Oregon State Parks Unit 27, was parked in the gravel driveway. It was a dark green Ford F250, built like a tank, with the state seal painted on the doors. He climbed in, started the engine, and let it warm up for a moment while he checked his clipboard. His route that day was straightforward. Patrolled the southern section of Cape Meares State Scenic Viewpoint. Check the campgrounds for illegal fires. Inspect the coastal trail for damage after the recent storms. And swing by the fire lookout tower on the ridge to make sure it was still locked. It was routine work. Nothing unusual. Nothing dangerous. By 6:15 Bill was on the road, heading west, toward the coast. The sky was overcast, as it often was in September. The fog hadn't rolled in yet, but it was coming. You could feel it in the air. The stillness, the weight of moisture waiting to descend. He drove slowly, scanning the roadside for signs of fallen trees or washouts. The road was empty. It always was at this hour. Most tourists didn't arrive until later in the day, and the locals knew better than to venture into the forest when the fog was heavy. At 7 o'clock, Bill radioed the Cape Meares Ranger Station. Unit 27 to base. On site. Visibility's dropping fast. Fog's moving in from the west. Roads are clear so far. Over. The voice that crackled back belonged to Ranger Clifford Dean, who was stationed at the main office that morning. Copy that, Bill. Keep us posted, and be careful out there. Weather's supposed to get worse by noon. Over. Will do. Out. That was the last time anyone heard William Harrow's voice. Bill continued along the fire road that wound through the dense forest. The trees here were ancient, towering Douglas firs and Sitka spruces that blocked out the sky, their branches draped in moss that hung like curtains. The ground was covered in ferns and fallen needles, soft and silent underfoot. The fog began to roll in around 7:30. It came slowly at first, drifting between the tree trunks in pale ribbons. Then it thickened, spreading across the road like smoke, muffling sound and swallowing distance. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Bill slowed the truck to a crawl. He turned on his headlights, but the fog reflected the light back at him, making it harder to see. He knew this road by heart, though he didn't need to see it clearly. At 8:15, he radioed again. Unit 27, to base, low visibility. Heavy fog on the southern trail line. Slowing down. Might take longer than expected. Over. Clifford's voice came back, distorted by static. Copy, Bill. Take your time. No rush. Over. There was a pause. Then Bill's voice returned. Quieter, this time, almost uncertain. Cliff, you ever hear about unusual movement out here? Off-trail static hissed through the radio. Say again, Bill. Unusual movement. Over. Another pause. Never mind. Probably just an animal. Out. That was the last transmission anyone ever received from Ranger William Harrow. When Bill didn't return home by dinner that evening, Eleanor wasn't immediately worried. His shifts often ran long, especially when the weather was bad. She fed the kids, cleaned up the kitchen, and waited. By 9 o'clock, the fog outside was so thick you couldn't see the road. The phone rang. It was Clifford Dean. Eleanor, is Bill home yet? Her stomach tightened. No, he's not. Why? He was supposed to check back in by 5. We haven't heard from him since this morning. Eleanor's hand gripped the phone receiver. What do you mean you haven't heard from him? I'm sure it's nothing, Clifford said quickly. Radio's probably just dead. We'll send someone out first thing in the morning. But Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock, watching the hours crawl by. The search began at dawn on September 4th. A team of rangers, state police, and volunteers spread out along the fire roads and trails where Bill had been working. They called his name into the fog. They searched every clearing, every campground, every overlook. By mid-afternoon, they found his truck. It was parked on a closed fire road, about 3 miles south of the main trail. The engine was cold. The driver's door was open. The keys were still in the ignition. On the seat was Bill's clipboard, exactly where he always kept it. His thermos sat in the Q folder, still half full of cold coffee, and beside the rear tire, lying in a shallow puddle of rainwater, was his wide-brimmed ranger's hat. But there was no sign of Bill, no footprints, no blood, no struggle, no body. It was as if he had simply stepped out of the truck and vanished into the fog. The official search lasted 2 weeks. Helicopters flew over the cliffs and canyon, their rotors thumping through the mist. Search dogs were brought in, tracking bills sent through the undergrowth, but the trails led nowhere. Volunteers combed the forest on foot, calling his name until their voices were hoarse. They found nothing. On the second night of the search, Clifford Dean reported something strange. He'd been assigned to patrol the northern section of the forest, far from where Bill's truck had been found. Around midnight, while walking a ridge trail, he saw a light in the distance, a steady, flickering glow, like a lantern moving slowly through the trees. It wasn't bouncing around like someone running, Clifford told investigators later. It was moving in circles, slow and deliberate, like someone was searching for something. He radioed for backup and headed toward the light. But by the time he reached the area, the light was gone. There were no footprints, no sign of a campfire or lantern, nothing, just silence. In the days that followed, rumors began to spread through netards. Some locals claimed that Bill had been worried about something in the weeks before he disappeared. A waitress at the diner said he'd come in one afternoon and mentioned off-book campers living in an old fire lookout tower, deep in the forest where no one was supposed to be. He said they weren't on any permit list, she recalled. Said it didn't sit right with him. But when investigators searched the fire lookout tower, they found it locked and abandoned, just as it had been for years. There was no sign of recent activity, no evidence that anyone had been there. Others whispered darker theories. Some said Bill had stumbled onto something illegal, poachers, drug runners, something that got him killed. Others believed he'd simply gotten lost in the fog and fallen off a cliff. But none of these explanations fit the facts. Bill's truck had been found on a closed fire road. He hadn't been hiking, he hadn't been near any cliffs, and he knew the forest too well to simply wander off and get lost. Eleanor refused to believe he was gone. He's out there, she said, her voice steady but hollow. He's out there, and he's waiting for us to find him. But as the weeks turned into months, hope began to fade. The search was officially called off in late October. The case was classified as accidental misadventure, though no body had been found, no evidence recovered, and no logical explanation offered. William Harrow was 41 years old. He had a wife who loved him, 2 children who needed him, and a job he was good at. And on a foggy morning in September 1975, he drove into the Oregon wilderness and was never seen again. The first winter after Bill Harrow disappeared was the coldest Tillamook County had seen. Snow fell in November, which was rare for the coast. It covered the forest in white silence, burying trails and roads beneath drifts that wouldn't melt until spring. The search had been called off by then, but Eleanor still drove out to Cape Mears every weekend, parking near the fire road where Bill's truck had been found, staring into the trees as if she might see him walking out of the fog. She never did. The investigation, such as it was, continued through the winter and into the following year. But it was slow, fragmented, and ultimately fruitless. The Oregon State Police had no leads, no witnesses, and no body. The official file on William Harrow remained open, but inactive. The case became a matter of paperwork, not urgency. By the spring of 1976, most people had stopped talking about it, but Eleanor never stopped searching. In those early months, she became obsessed with the details. She read every police report, every witness statement, every scrap of information she could find. She interviewed the volunteers who had searched the forest. She spoke to Clifford Dean for hours, asking him to repeat everything he remembered about that day. The radio transmissions, the weather, the strange light he'd seen moving through the trees. "Do you think someone else was out there?" she asked him once, sitting across from him in the ranger station office, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. Clifford hesitated. He was a cautious man, careful with his words. "I don't know," he said finally. But something didn't feel right. The way that light was moving, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. "Do you think it was Bill?" Clifford shook his head slowly. "If it was Bill, why didn't he answer when we called for him?" Eleanor had no answer to that. The months dragged on, and the seasons changed. Spring turned to summer, and the tourists returned to Cape Mears. They hiked the trails and climbed to the lighthouse, and took pictures of the ocean. None of them knew that a man had vanished here less than a year ago. None of them noticed the missing ranger. Eleanor went back to teaching. Susan graduated high school and left for college in Portland. Tom grew quiet and withdrawn, spending long hours alone in his room. The family tried to move forward, but the absence of Bill was a weight that pressed down on everything. At night, Eleanor lay awake in bed, listening to the wind outside, imagining she heard the sound of Bill's truck pulling into the driveway. She would get up and look out the window, but the driveway was always empty. "He's not coming back," her mother told her once, gently. "You have to accept that." But Eleanor couldn't. "They didn't find a body," she said. "That means he's still out there." In the summer of 1977, 2 years after Bill's disappearance, a small piece of evidence finally surfaced. A group of hikers was exploring an area about 10 miles north of Cape Mears, near a place called Munson Creek. They were off-trail, pushing through thick undergrowth near the base of a waterfall, when one of them noticed something wedged between the roots of a fallen tree. It was a map. The paper was torn and stained. The ink faded from exposure to rain and sun. But when they unfolded it carefully, they could still make out the lines of trails and roads, the markings of campgrounds and fire roads, and in the margin, written in pencil, were 4 words: "Trail, not on file." The handwriting matched Bill Harrow's ranger's journal. The hikers turned the map over to the Oregon State Police. Investigators examined it closely, comparing the handwriting to samples from Bill's logbook. It was a match. The map had belonged to him. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why had the map been found 10 miles from where his truck had been abandoned? Had Bill walked that far on foot? And what did trail not on file mean? Was he tracking something? Someone? The police searched the area where the map was found. They brought in dogs again, hoping to pick up a scent. But 2 years had passed. Rain and snow had erased whatever traces might have been left behind. They found nothing else. Eleanor held the map in her hands when the police returned it to her months later. She ran her fingers over the pencil marks, tracing the lines Bill had drawn. "He found something," she said quietly. "Something he wasn't supposed to find. But what? No one could say." The years passed slowly after that. By 1980, the case had gone completely cold. The police stopped investigating. The file was archived. The newspapers stopped writing about it. Bill Harrow became a name people remembered vaguely, if they remembered him at all. Eleanor aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. Her hair turned grey. Her face grew lined and tired. She stopped driving out to Cape Mears every weekend. She stopped asking questions. But she never stopped believing that Bill was out there, somewhere, waiting. Susan and Tom grew up and moved away. Susan became a nurse Tom joined the Coast Guard and was stationed in Alaska. They called their mother every week, but they rarely came home. Netarts reminded them too much of what they'd lost. Eleanor stayed. She couldn't leave. Not when Bill might still come back. In 1983, something else happened. A fisherman named Roy Gillis was working his nets near the mouth of the Tillamook River when he found a keyring tangled in the line. It was old and corroded, covered in barnacles and green with algae. He almost threw it back into the water, but something made him pause. He cleaned it off and saw that it had a small metal tag attached to it. The tag was engraved with a number, Unit 27. Roy brought the keyring to the sheriff's office. The keys were sent to the state police for analysis. It took weeks to confirm, but eventually they traced the number back to Bill Harrow's Ranger vehicle. The discovery made the local news for a few days. Reporters called Eleanor, asking for her reaction. She gave them the same answer she always did. It means he's still out there. But the police weren't so sure. The keys had been found in the river, miles from where Bill's truck had been abandoned. How had they ended up there? Had someone thrown them? Had they been carried by the current? There was no way to know. By the late 1980s, the world had moved on. New cases came and went. New mysteries replaced the old one. People stopped talking about Bill Harrow. His name appeared in books about unsolved disappearances, but only briefly, as a footnote in a chapter about missing rangers. Eleanor grew older. Her health declined. She developed arthritis and had trouble walking. Susan and Tom begged her to move in with one of them, but she refused. "I can't leave," she told them. Not yet. She still kept Bill's Ranger's journal on the nightstand beside her bed. She read it sometimes, late at night, tracing her fingers over his handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane notes about trail conditions, weather reports, maintenance schedules. But there was one entry, dated a week before Bill disappeared, that she read over and over again. Heard whistling again near Ridge Line. Not wind, this time. What did it mean? Who had been whistling? And why had Bill written again, as if he'd heard it before? In 1991, 16 years after Bill's disappearance, Eleanor received a letter. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address. The postmark was from Portland, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it carefully and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The letter was short. Mrs. Harrow, I was camping near Cape Meares in September 1975. I saw a ranger that morning. He was standing near the fire road, looking into the trees. He seemed nervous. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I've thought about it a lot over the years. I should have said something back then. I'm sorry. I don't know if this helps, but I wanted you to know that someone saw him that day. He wasn't alone. The letter was unsigned. Eleanor read it 3 times, then folded it and put it in the drawer, where she kept all the other pieces of evidence. The map, the photographs, the police report. She never showed it to anyone. The 1990s came and went. Eleanor's health continued to decline. She had a stroke in 1995 and spent several weeks in the hospital. When she came home, she could no longer climb the stairs in her house. Susan moved back to Netarts to take care of her. One evening, sitting together on the porch, Eleanor looked out at the forest and said quietly, I used to think I'd see him again. I used to think he'd come walking out of those trees one day, and everything would go back to normal. Susan took her mother's hand. I know, Mom, but he's not coming back, is he? Susan didn't answer. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the silence settle around them. By the year 2000, 25 years had passed since Bill Harrow disappeared. Eleanor was 73 years old. She could barely walk. Her memory was fading. She spent most of her days sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the road, waiting for something she couldn't name. She died quietly in her sleep on a cold night in November. She was buried in a small cemetery outside Netarts, next to an empty grave with Bill's name on the headstone. There was no body to bury, but Eleanor had insisted on the marker years earlier. He'll come back, she'd said, and when he does, he'll know where to find me. The case of William Harrow remained officially unsolved. The police file was archived in a dusty storage room in Salem, alongside thousands of other cold cases. No one looked at it anymore. No one remembered. But in Netarts, the old-timers still told stories about the ranger who vanished into the fog. And sometimes, late at night, when the mist rolled in from the ocean, people claimed they could hear something out in the forest. A low, rising whistle, slow and deliberate, like someone searching for something. 20 years passed. The world changed in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1975. Cell phones became ubiquitous. The internet connected every corner of the globe. GPS satellites made it nearly impossible to get truly lost. The wilderness that had once swallowed Bill Harrow whole was now mapped down to the square meter. But some mysteries refused to die. In the summer of 2015, 40 years after Bill's disappearance, a hiker named Marcus Chen was exploring a remote section of the Tillamook State Forest, miles from any established trail. He was an experienced outdoorsman, the kind who preferred solitude and silence to crowded campgrounds and marked paths. It was late July, and the weather was unusually hot for the Oregon coast. The forest was dry, the air thick with the smell of pine resin and sun-baked earth. Marcus had been hiking for hours, following an old logging road that had been abandoned decades earlier. Around mid-afternoon, he stopped to rest near the base of a massive old-growth spruce. The tree was ancient, its trunk wider than a car, its roots sprawling across the ground like fingers clawing into the soil. That's when he saw it. Wedged between two of the thick roots, half buried in moss and dirt, was something metallic. At first, Marcus thought it was just a piece of old equipment, a rusted bolt or hinge left behind by loggers. But when he knelt down and brushed away the moss, he realized what he was looking at. It was a badge. The metal was corroded and pitted, the surface green with oxidation, but the shape was unmistakable, a five-pointed star with an embossed seal in the center. And at the bottom, barely legible beneath decades of rust, was a number 27. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, his heart beating faster. He'd lived in Oregon his whole life. He knew the stories. He knew about the ranger who had vanished in 1975 and was never found. He pulled out his phone and took a picture. Then, carefully, he worked the badge free from the roots and slipped it into his backpack. 2 days later, Marcus walked into the Tillamook County Sheriff's Office and placed the badge on the front desk. "I think this might be important," he said. The deputy on duty looked at the badge, frowned, and called his supervisor. Within an hour, the badge had been photographed, catalogued, and sent to the state police for analysis. It took less than a week to confirm what everyone already suspected. The badge belonged to Ranger William Harrow. Badge number 27, Oregon State Parks, issued in 1963, reported missing in 1975, and it had been found nearly 15 miles from where Bill's truck had been abandoned. The discovery made headlines. Local newspapers ran front-page stories. Television stations sent reporters to Cape Mears. True crime podcasters dug up old interviews and police reports. For the first time in decades, people were talking about Bill Harrow again. The Oregon State Police reopened the case. A new team of investigators was assigned. They reviewed all the old evidence, the map, the keyring, the witness statements, the search records. They interviewed everyone who was still alive and willing to talk. They brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar and searched the area where the badge had been found. But they found nothing else. No body, no bones, no clothing, no gear. Just the badge, lodged in the roots of a tree that had been standing long before Bill Harrow was born. Susan Harrow was 66 years old when she heard the news. She was living in Portland, working part-time as a hospice nurse. Her husband had died 3 years earlier. Her brother Tom had passed away in 2008, killed in a helicopter accident while serving in the Coast Guard. She was the last one left. When the state police called to tell her about the badge, she sat down slowly in her kitchen chair and stared at the phone in her hand. "After all this time," she said quietly, "after all this time, and that's all they found." The detective on the other end of the line was sympathetic, but professional. "We're doing everything we can, Miss Harrow. We haven't given up." But Susan had heard those words before. 40 years ago, sitting in this same kitchen, listening to her mother cry on the phone with investigators who promised they would find him. They never did. In the weeks that followed, Susan found herself drawn back to Netarts. She drove out on a Saturday morning, the highway winding through green hills and coastal forests. It had been years since she'd been back. The town looked smaller than she remembered, quieter, more warm. She parked near the old cemetery and walked to her mother's grave. Eleanor's headstone was simple, her name, her dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Wife and Mother." Next to it was the empty grave with Bill's marker. Susan stood there for a long time, the wind rustling through the trees overhead. "They found something, Dad," she said softly. "Your badge. After all this time, someone found your badge." The wind didn't answer. That evening, Susan drove out to Cape Meares. The forest was quiet in the fading light. The air smelled of salt and cedar. She parked near the fire road where her father's truck had been found and stepped out into the cool evening air. The trees loomed around her, dark and ancient, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. She walked a little way down the road, her footsteps crunching on gravel. She didn't know what she was looking for. She just needed to be here, to stand in the place where her father had last been seen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog began to roll in. It came slowly, drifting through the trees, turning the forest into a landscape of shadows and mist. Susan pulled her jacket tighter and turned back toward her car. And then she heard it. A sound, faint and distant, carried on the wind. A whistle, low and rising, slow and deliberate. Susan froze. The sound echoed through the trees, then faded into silence. She stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding, listening. But the forest was quiet again. She hurried back to her car, climbed in, and locked the doors. Her hands were shaking as she started the engine. As she drove away, she looked in the rearview mirror at the forest disappearing into the fog. And she wondered, just for a moment, if someone was still out there searching. The investigation continued through the fall and into the winter. Detectives combed through the old case files, looking for anything they might have missed. They interviewed Marcus Chen again, asking him to show them exactly where he'd found the badge. They searched the surrounding area with dogs and metal detectors. They found nothing. In December, a forensic team examined the badge more closely. They analyzed the corrosion patterns, trying to determine how long it had been in the ground. The results were inconclusive. The badge could have been there for 40 years, or it could have been placed there more recently. One detail troubled investigators. The roots of the spruce tree had grown round the badge, encasing it in wood and bark. That process would have taken years, possibly decades, which meant the badge had been there for a long time. But how had it gotten there? In January 2016, a retired logger named Frank Holloway came forward with new information. Frank was 78 years old and had spent most of his life working in the Tillamook forests. He'd been part of the original search effort in 1975, one of the volunteers who had combed the woods looking for Bill Harrow. He called the state police and asked to speak to the lead investigator. "I've been thinking about something," Frank said when the detective picked up the phone. "Something I saw back then. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I think it might matter." The detective arranged to meet him the next day. Frank Holloway sat across from Detective Sarah Kellerman in a small interview room at the state police office in Tillamook. He was a big man, stooped with age, his hands gnarled from decades of hard labor. "I was part of the search team in 75, Frank began. "We were out there for 2 weeks, looking for that ranger. I must have walked 50 miles through those woods." Detective Kellerman nodded, taking notes. "On the 4th or 5th day," Frank continued, "we were searching an area north of where his truck was found. Way north, maybe 10, 12 miles. We weren't supposed to be up there. It was outside the search grid. But a couple of us figured, hell, maybe he'd wandered farther than anyone thought." He paused, his eyes distant. "We came across an old cabin. It wasn't on any map. Just a little shack, really. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. The door was hanging off the hinges. The windows were busted out. But inside there were signs that someone had been there recently." "What kind of signs?" Kellerman asked. "Footprints in the dust. A couple of cans of food, not too rusted. A sleeping bag in the corner. And on the wall, someone had carved something into the wood." "What did it say?" Frank hesitated. "It was just a date. September 3rd, 1975. Kellerman set down her pen. "The day Ranger Harrow disappeared." Frank nodded slowly. "I told the other guys, and we reported it to the search coordinator. But by the time they sent someone out to check, the cabin was gone, burned down. Nothing left but ashes and a stone chimney. They figured it was an accident, maybe a lightning strike or something. But I always wondered." He trailed off, staring at his hands. "You think someone burned it on purpose?" Kellerman asked. Frank looked up at her. "I think someone didn't want us to find what was in that cabin." Detective Kellerman spent the next week trying to verify Frank's story. She reviewed the old search records, looking for any mention of a cabin. She found a single brief notation in the logs, dated September 9th, 1975. "Possible structure located, grid sector N12. Team dispatched to investigate. Structure destroyed by fire prior to arrival. No evidence recovered." That was all. No photographs, no follow-up investigation, no explanation. Kellerman drove out to the coordinates listed in the report, bringing a topographical map and a GPS unit. It took her most of the afternoon to reach the area, hiking through dense forest and undergrowth. She found the chimney. It stood alone in a small clearing, a column of moss-covered stone rising from the forest floor. Around it, barely visible beneath 40 years of growth, were the faint outlines of a foundation. Kellerman photographed everything, then searched the area carefully. Most of the debris had long since rotted away or been buried by vegetation. But after an hour of searching, she found something. Buried in the dirt near the base of the chimney was a piece of metal, blackened by fire but still intact. It was a belt buckle, the kind issued to Oregon State Parks rangers in the 1970s. The belt buckle was sent to the lab for analysis. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The metal showed traces of human blood, degraded but still identifiable. DNA testing was attempted, but the sample was too degraded to produce a usable profile. The buckle was the same type issued to Bill Harrow, but there was no way to prove it had belonged to him. In March 2016, Detective Kellerman held a press conference. She stood at a podium in front of a dozen reporters and cameras, the case file on the table beside her. After reviewing new evidence and conducting additional interviews, she said, "We have reason to believe that Ranger William Harrow may have traveled much farther from his vehicle than previously thought. We are currently investigating the possibility that he encountered someone in the forest that day, someone who may have been living off-grid in an abandoned structure." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We do not believe this was an accident. We believe foul play may have been involved." The room erupted with questions. Kellerman held up a hand. "At this time, we have no suspects. The case remains open and active. Anyone with information is encouraged to contact the Oregon State Police." Susan watched the press conference from her living room in Portland. When it was over, she turned off the television and sat in silence for a long time. Foul play. After 40 years, they finally had a name for what had happened to her father. Someone had killed him, and whoever it was had gotten away with it. The press conference changed everything. Within days, the tip line was flooded with calls. People who had been children in 1975 now came forward with fragments of memory. Hikers who had been in the area that September recalled strange encounters. Former residents of Netarts shared rumors they'd heard decades ago, but never reported. Most of the tips led nowhere, but a few opened doors that had been closed for 40 years. Detective Sarah Kellerman spent weeks sorting through the information, cross-referencing statements, building timelines. She was methodical, patient, determined not to overlook anything, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The first significant lead came from a woman named Patricia Moore. Patricia was 62 years old and lived in Eugene. She called the tip line on a Thursday afternoon in late March and asked to speak directly to the detective in charge of the Harrow case. "I need to tell you something," she said, when Kellerman answered. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Kellerman arranged to meet her the following day. Patricia Moore sat in the same interview room where Frank Holloway had told his story weeks earlier. She was thin and nervous, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "In 1975, I was 19 years old," she began. "I was living in Tillamook, working at a diner on the highway. My boyfriend at the time, his name was Jesse Cartwright." Kellerman wrote down the name. "Jesse was trouble," Patricia continued. "He was involved in things I didn't fully understand. Back then, drugs, mostly, small-time dealing. But he knew people, dangerous people." She paused, gathering herself. "That summer, Jesse started acting strange, paranoid. He kept saying someone was watching him, that the Rangers were getting too close. I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was just being dramatic." "Close to what?" Kellerman asked. Patricia looked down at her hands. "There was a group of guys living out in the forest, off the grid. They were growing marijuana way back in the woods, miles from any trail. Jesse was involved with them. He'd go out there for days at a time, come back with cash." Kellerman leaned forward. "Did Jesse ever mention a ranger named Bill Harrow?" Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, he mentioned him, more than once." Patricia's voice trembled as she continued. "About a week before that ranger disappeared, Jesse came to my apartment late at night. He was drunk and scared. He told me the ranger had been snooping around, asking questions about people living off-trail. He said the ranger had come too close to their operation. What did he say they were going to do about it?" Patricia wiped her eyes. "He said they were going to handle it. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't want to know. I told him I didn't want to hear about it anymore. She took a shaky breath. Then, a few days later, I heard on the news that a ranger had gone missing. I remember the name, William Harrow. And I knew. Why didn't you come forward? Kellerman asked gently. I was scared. Jesse told me if I said anything, they'd come after me. And then Jesse disappeared. Two tets, single quotes. Kellerman sat up straighter. He disappeared. Patricia nodded. About 2 weeks after the ranger went missing. Jesse just vanished. He didn't tell me where he was going. He didn't say goodbye. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone. I never saw him again. Detective Kellerman ran Jesse Cartwright's name through every database she had access to. Jesse Lee Cartwright, born January 15, 1954, in Tillamook, Oregon. Dropped out of high school in 1971. Arrested twice for possession of marijuana, once in 1973, and again in 1974. No permanent address, no employment records after 1975, and no death certificate. Jesse Cartwright had simply disappeared. Kellerman expanded her search. She contacted police departments in surrounding counties, sent inquiries to the FBI, checked missing persons databases. Nothing. Jesse Cartwright had vanished as completely as Bill Harrow. The investigation took on new urgency. Kellerman assembled a team of detectives and began tracking down everyone who had known Jesse Cartwright in 1975. Most were dead or impossible to locate, but a few were still around. One of them was a man named Dennis Kowalski. Dennis was 71 years old and living in a nursing home in Salem. He'd been arrested multiple times in the 1970s for drug-related offenses and had spent 10 years in prison. He'd been clean for decades now, but his memory of those years was still sharp. When Kellerman showed him a photograph of Jesse Cartwright, Dennis's expression darkened. Yeah, I knew him, he said. Wish I didn't. Can you tell me about him? Dennis leaned back in his wheelchair and stared out the window. Jesse was a hustler, always looking for an angle. He got involved with some guys up near Cape Mears, growing weed in the forest. It was a decent operation for a while. But Jesse got paranoid, started thinking everyone was out to get him. Did he ever mention a park ranger? Dennis nodded slowly. Yeah. He talked about some ranger who was asking too many questions. Jesse was convinced the guy was going to find their grow site and shut them down. What happened? Dennis was quiet for a long moment. I don't know for sure, but Jesse came to me one night, real late, maybe mid-September. He was freaked out, said something bad had happened, said someone got hurt. He wouldn't tell me who or what, but he was scared. Did he say anything else? He said he was leaving. Said if anyone asked, I didn't know where he went. And then he was gone. Kellerman wrote quickly in her notebook. Do you know where he went? Dennis shook his head. No idea. And I didn't ask. When Jesse Cartwright tells you to forget you ever knew him, you listen. Over the next few weeks, 2 more people came forward with similar stories. A former bartender in Netarts remembered Jesse Cartwright bragging about teaching some park ranger a lesson in the days before Bill's disappearance. A retired truck driver recalled giving a ride to a young man matching Jesse's description in late September 1975. The man had been hitchhiking on Highway 101, heading south toward California. He'd been nervous, looking over his shoulder constantly, and had paid in cash. He told me he was leaving Oregon and never coming back, the driver said. I asked him why. He just said, some things you can't undo. In May 2016, Detective Kellerman received a package in the mail. It was a small, padded envelope with no return address. The postmark was from Eugene. Inside was a cassette tape. Kellerman stared at it for a moment, then found an old cassette player in the evidence storage room. She inserted the tape and pressed play. The recording was poor quality, full of static and background noise, but the voice was clear enough. It was Patricia Moore, Detective Kellerman. I found this in a box of Jesse's things that I kept all these years. I didn't know it existed until I started going through old stuff after we talked. I think you need to hear it. There was a pause, then the sound of another tape starting. This recording was even older. The audio degraded and warped, but the voice was unmistakable. Young, male, agitated. Pat, if you're listening to this, it means something happened to me. I need you to know. I didn't mean for it to go that way. We were just trying to scare him, you know. Just get him to back off. But things got out of hand. A long pause. The sound of breathing. The ranger, Harrow. He didn't go down easy. He fought back. And Marcus lost it. He hit him with a shovel. Hard. And the guy he just dropped. We didn't know what to do. He was bleeding. He was unconscious. We panicked. Another pause. We dragged him to the old cabin. Thought maybe we could figure something out. Get him help or something. But he never woke up. He stopped breathing. And we didn't know what to do with the body. The voice broke, became quieter. We buried him out there, in the woods, miles from anywhere. Marcus said no one would ever find him. Said we just had to keep our mouths shut, and it would blow over. A long silence, filled only with the hiss of the tape. But it didn't blow over. They're looking for him. The whole county's looking for him. And I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving. If they catch me, they catch me. But I can't stay here. The tape clicked off. Kellerman sat in stunned silence, staring at the cassette player. She played the tape for Susan Harrow 3 days later. They met in Susan's living room in Portland. Susan sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed but pale. When the tape ended, Susan closed her eyes. So that's what happened, she said quietly. Kellerman nodded. We believe so. Jesse Cartwright, and at least one other person, someone named Marcus, were involved in your father's death. It started as intimidation, but it escalated. They killed him, probably accidentally, and buried his body somewhere in the forest. Susan opened her eyes and looked at the detective. Will you be able to find him? Kellerman hesitated. We're going to try, but it's been 40 years, and the forest is vast. Without more specific information about where they buried him, she didn't finish the sentence. Susan nodded, slowly. I understand. The Oregon State Police launched a massive search operation in June 2016. Using the information from the tape and the location of the burned cabin, they focused on a 10-square-mile area of dense forest. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists, and volunteers. They searched for 3 months, and in late August, in a remote ravine, less than a mile from where the cabin had stood, they found something. Human remains, partially buried beneath decades of soil and vegetation. The bones were incomplete, scattered by animals and time, but enough remained to identify them. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. They had found William Harrow. On September 3, 2016, exactly 41 years after his disappearance, Ranger William Harrow was laid to rest. The funeral was held in Netots, in the small cemetery where Eleanor had been buried 16 years earlier. Hundreds of people attended. Retired rangers, old friends, members of the community who remembered. Susan stood at the graveside, flanked by her cousins and a few close friends. The wind blew in from the ocean, carrying the scent of salt and cedar. The priest said a few words. A ranger in full uniform played taps on a trumpet. And then, slowly, the casket was lowered into the ground beside Eleanor's grave. Susan knelt and placed a hand on the earth. You can rest now, Dad, she whispered. You're home. The investigation into Jesse Cartwright and the man known as Marcus continued. Detectives searched for any records, any trace of where they might have gone. But the trail was cold. Jesse had vanished in 1975, and no one named Marcus matching the description had ever been identified. In October 2016, a retired FBI agent contacted Detective Kellerman with a possible lead. In 1978, a man matching Jesse Cartwright's description had been killed in a bar fight in Reno, Nevada. The body had been buried in a pauper's grave under the name John Doe No. 47. DNA testing had never been done. Kellerman requested an exhumation. 3 weeks later, the results came back. It was Jesse Cartwright. He'd been dead for 38 years, buried in an unmarked grave, his real name unknown. The man called Marcus was never found. In December 2016, Detective Sarah Kellerman closed the case file on William Harrow. Cause of death, homicide, blunt force trauma to the head. Suspects, Jesse Lee Cartwright, deceased, and an unidentified male accomplice. Status, closed by exceptional clearance. Kellerman placed the file in the archive box and sealed it with tape. It was over. After 41 years, the mystery of what happened to Ranger William Harrow had finally been solved. But some questions would never be answered. Who was Marcus? Where did he go? And why had he never come forward? Kellerman didn't know, and she suspected no one ever would. The winter of 2016 came early to the Oregon coast. By November, the rains had returned in full force, drumming against rooftops and turning the forest trails to mud. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, just as it had 41 years earlier, swallowing the trees and cliffs in grey silence. In Netots, life went on as it always had. Fishermen mended their nets. The diner on the highway served coffee and pie to locals, and the occasional lost tourist. The elementary school where Eleanor Harrow had once taught still stood at the edge of town, though it had been renovated twice since her time. But something had changed. The town that had lived for decades with an unanswered question now had its answer. The ranger who had vanished into the fog had been found. The mystery was solved, and yet the silence remained. Susan Harrow stood in her father's old cabin for the first time in 20 years. After the funeral, she'd decided to keep the property rather than sell it. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was sentiment. Maybe it was the feeling that, after everything, someone should remember. Someone should bear witness to what had been lost. The cabin was small and quiet. The furniture was outdated. The walls faded. But it still smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee, the way it had when she was a child. She walked through the rooms slowly, running her fingers along the wall, remembering. In the kitchen, she found her father's old percolator still sitting on the stove. In the bedroom, his uniform hung in the closet, the fabric moth-eaten but still recognizable. And on the nightstand, exactly where her mother had left it, was Bill's Ranger Journal. Susan picked it up carefully and opened it to the last entry. September 2nd, 1975. Clear skies today. Finished trail maintenance on the South Ridge. Saw fresh tire tracks near the old fire road. No permit on file. We'll check tomorrow. Heard whistling again near Ridgeline. Not wind this time. She closed the journal and held it against her chest. Her father had known something was wrong. He'd sensed it. And he'd gone out there anyway, because that was his job. That was who he was. A man who didn't walk away from trouble. A man who believed in doing what was right, even when it was dangerous. In the months following the funeral, Susan found herself drawn back to Cape Mears. She would drive out on weekends, park near the trailhead, and walk through the forest where her father had spent so much of his life. The trees were the same. The fog still rolled in from the ocean. The whistle of the wind through the branches sounded almost like music. Almost. One Saturday in late January, she hiked to the spot where the badge had been found. The old spruce tree still stood, massive and ancient, its roots sprawling across the ground. Someone had left flowers at its base, fresh wildflowers, tied with a ribbon. Susan knelt and touched the flowers gently. Someone else remembered too. The case had brought closure, but it had also opened old wounds. In the weeks after the news broke about Jesse Cartwright's confession, several people in Tillamook County came forward with their own stories, not about Bill Harrow, but about other things that had happened in those years. Other disappearances, other mysteries that had never been solved. A logger who had vanished in 1973, a hitchhiker who was last seen near Highway 101 in 1977, a fisherman whose boat was found empty and adrift in 1980. Detective Sarah Kellerman listened to all of them, took notes, opened files. She couldn't promise answers, but she could promise that someone was listening now. Sometimes, she told Susan during one of their last conversations, solving one mystery gives people permission to talk about others. It's like breaking a seal. Once the silence is broken, people start to remember. They start to speak. Susan nodded. "Do you think you'll find Marcus?" she asked. Kellerman was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. He could be dead. He could be living under a different name halfway across the country. Or he could be right here, still in Oregon, watching all of this unfold, and keeping quiet. Does that scare you?" "No," Kellerman said. "What scares me is the idea that there might be others like him. People who did terrible things and got away with it. People who live their whole lives carrying that weight, never speaking, never confessing." She looked out the window at the grey sky. "I wonder what that does to a person. I wonder if they ever find peace." In March 2017, a letter arrived at the Oregon State Police headquarters. It was addressed to Detective Sarah Kellerman, written in shaky handwriting on lined notebook paper. There was no return address. The postmark was from Bend, Oregon. Kellerman opened it carefully and read, "Detective Kellerman, I've been following the news about the ranger. I want you to know that I'm sorry. I've been sorry for 42 years. My name doesn't matter. You'll never find me, and I won't turn myself in. I'm an old man now, and I don't have much time left, but I wanted you to know the truth. It was an accident. We were young and stupid and scared. We thought we were protecting something that mattered, but we were just protecting ourselves. And when it all went wrong, we panicked. Jesse wanted to go to the police. I wouldn't let him. I told him we'd both go to prison, that our lives would be over. So we buried the ranger and tried to forget. But you don't forget something like that. You carry it with you every day for the rest of your life. Jesse couldn't handle it. He left Oregon and drank himself to death. I stayed. I built a life. I got married, had kids, worked an honest job, but it was all built on a lie. And every time I saw a park ranger, every time I drove past Cape Mears, I felt it, the weight of what I'd done. I'm telling you this because I want the ranger's family to know that he didn't suffer. It was quick, and we didn't hurt him on purpose. It was just ... wrong place, wrong time, wrong decisions. I know that doesn't make it better. I know there's nothing I can say that will undo what happened, but I needed you to know. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Cancer. Stage 4. I've got maybe a month left, and when I die, the last person who knows the whole truth will be gone too. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. M. Kellerman read the letter 3 times, then placed it carefully in an evidence bag. She called Susan that afternoon and read it to her over the phone. When she finished, there was a long silence. Do you believe him? Susan asked finally. Yes, Kellerman said. I do. Do you think he's really dying? I think so. And I think he wanted to confess before he did. Another silence. What will you do with the letter? Susan asked. I'll file it with the case. It's evidence, even if we'll never be able to prosecute. It's part of the record now. Part of the truth. Susan exhaled slowly. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. Susan Harrow died peacefully in her sleep on a warm night in June 2021. She was 71 years old. She'd lived long enough to see her father found, buried, and remembered. She'd lived long enough to know the truth. Her funeral was small and quiet. A few friends, a few distant relatives, a retired ranger who had known her father. They buried her in Portland, far from Netarts, far from the forest. But in her will, she left instructions that a plaque be placed at Cape Mears State Scenic Viewpoint, near the trailhead where her father had once worked. The plaque was installed in the fall of 2021. It's simple, made of bronze, mounted on a large stone at the edge of the forest. It reads, "In memory of Ranger William Harrow, Oregon State Parks, 1960 to 1975, who gave his life protecting these forests. May those who walk these trails remember his service." Below the inscription is a small engraving of a ranger's badge, number 27. Today, Cape Mears is much as it was in 1975. The lighthouse still stands on the rocky headland, guiding ships through the fog. The trails wind through ancient forests of spruce and fir. The ocean crashes against the cliffs, constant and unchanging. Tourists come and go, taking pictures, marveling at the view. Most of them never notice the plaque near the trailhead, and those who do rarely ask about the story behind it. But the locals know, they remember. And on certain mornings, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, some of them still claim they hear it, a low rising whistle, slow and deliberate, moving through the trees. The sound has become part of the local folklore now. The ghost whistle of Cape Mears, they call it. Some say it's just the wind, playing tricks. Others believe it's something more. A few old-timers, sitting in the diner over coffee, will tell you quietly that it's the ranger, still out there, still patrolling his trails, still doing his job. In 2023, a young park ranger named Emily Vasquez was assigned to Cape Mears. She was 26 years old, fresh out of the academy, eager and enthusiastic. On her first day, her supervisor took her on a tour of the area, showing her the trails, the campgrounds, the access roads. When they passed the plaque near the trailhead, Emily stopped to read it. Who was he? She asked. Her supervisor, a man in his 50s who had worked in Oregon parks for 30 years, looked at the plaque for a long moment. He was one of us, he said quietly. A good ranger. He disappeared in 1975. Took 40 years to find out what happened to him. What did happen? The supervisor told her the story. The fog, the disappearance, the long search, the discovery, the confession. Emily listened, her eyes wide. That's terrible, she said, when he finished. It is, the supervisor agreed, but it's also a reminder. This job isn't just about maintaining trails and checking permits. Sometimes it's dangerous. Sometimes you see things you're not supposed to see. And sometimes you have to decide whether to walk away or stand your ground. He looked at Emily seriously. Ranger Harrow stood his ground. That's why we remember him. Emily nodded slowly, looking back at the plaque. I'll remember, she said. The file on William Harrow sits in the Oregon State Police archives now, sealed and stored alongside thousands of other cases. It's marked closed exceptional clearance. Inside are photographs, witness statements, evidence logs, and the confession letter from the man who called himself M. Everything is documented, preserved, part of the official record. But some things can't be filed away. The memories, the grief, the questions that linger, even after the answers are found. Detective Sarah Kellerman retired in 2019. She sometimes thinks about the Harrow case, about the badge found in the tree roots, about the burned cabin, about the letter from a dying man seeking absolution. She wonders if Marcus found peace before he died. She wonders if forgiveness was possible for a crime like that. She doesn't have answers. She's learned, over the years, that some questions don't have them. On a foggy morning in September 2024, 49 years after Bill Harrow disappeared, a hiker was walking the Southern Trail near Cape Mears. The fog was thick, visibility almost zero. The hiker moved slowly, carefully, following the trail markers. And then, faint and distant, carried on the wind, came a sound, a whistle, low and rising, slow and deliberate. The hiker stopped and listened, trying to pinpoint the direction. But the fog swallowed sound, distorted it, made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. After a moment, the whistle stopped. The forest was silent again. The hiker stood there for a long time, alone in the mist, listening to nothing. Then, quietly, they continued down the trail. In Netarts, the old diner is still open. The fishermen still come in for coffee before dawn. The waitress still knows everyone's order by heart. And sometimes, late at night, when the place is empty and quiet, the conversation turns to old stories. Stories about the town, about the people who lived here, about the mysteries that were solved and the ones that never were. And eventually, someone always mentions the ranger, the man who disappeared into the fog, the man who was finally found, the man whose story became a reminder that some silences are louder than any confession. The forest remembers, the wind remembers, and somewhere, in the space between memory and myth, between truth and legend, the whistle still echoes through the trees. Not a ghost, not a warning, just the sound of something that was lost, then found, then carried forward into the stories we tell. A reminder that every disappearance leaves a mark, every silence has a weight, and every mystery, solved or not, becomes part of the landscape. In the end, the truth was simpler than anyone had imagined. A ranger doing his job, young men protecting their illegal operation, a confrontation that went too far, a moment of panic, a buried secret. No grand conspiracy, no supernatural forces, no elaborate cover-up, just human error, human fear, and the terrible consequences of both. But knowing the truth didn't make it easier. It didn't bring Bill Harrow back. It didn't give Eleanor the years she spent waiting. It didn't undo the damage done to Susan and Tom, growing up without their father. The truth only did one thing. It ended the silence. And sometimes, that has to be enough. On the plaque at Cape Mears, rain and wind and time have begun to wear away the edges of the engraved letters. In another 50 years, maybe the words will be illegible. Maybe no one will remember who William Harrow was, or what happened to him. But for now, the plaque stands, and the story endures. A cold case, unsolved for 40 years, finally brought into the light. A man who disappeared into the fog, finally brought home. A family who waited, finally given closure. And a forest that keeps its secrets, finally made to give one back. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved, but this one was. And in the solving, something was restored. Not justice, perhaps not peace, but truth. And sometimes, that's all we can ask for. The fog rolls in. The trees stand silent. And somewhere in the forest, the wind carries a sound that might be a whistle, or might just be the wind.